Well, really appreciate you being here today, Julia. Would love if you could just start by talking a little bit about your work at Horizons and how you got into this space. I know that you've spent time internationally. Would love to hear a little bit about how Horizons got formed and how you see your role in the broader ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. My formal title is Chief Network Weaver at the Horizons Project. And the origin story about Horizons actually is that we were formed as a project under Partners Global when I used to be the CEO over there. And spent, 14 years as the head of, an international non-for-profit doing democracy promotion and peace building work. And around the pandemic, we were like a lot of international organizations looking at having a domestic program. And so in 21, we established the Horizons Project as a subsidiary, kind of as part of Partners Global. And then just for our business model, for the leadership transition to the next generation of leaders at Partners, it just made sense for us to take it outside. And so we are fiscally sponsored at the new venture fund. And Maria, Stefan, and I kind of came together to co-lead the Horizons. She's the chief organizer. And we're a really small team. There's five full-time staff at Horizons. We consider ourselves organizers, but really we formed Horizons to address a problem that we saw in our overseas work was that we didn't see enough folks playing the function of connective tissue, working as kind of organizers within the kind of network and networks ecosystem level. And specifically because Humanity United was one of the original kind of funders of the work, we really saw a lot of tension both in our international work and it kind of bleeds over into how we're observing the ecosystem in the US. Is just a long-standing tension between a peace-building approach and a resistance approach or a human rights approach to change making. And obviously, Maria's work at USIP also really informed her kind of melding of peace building and strategic nonviolent action with their synergizing nonviolent action and peace building guide, SNAP. So we really are very squarely trying to serve that connective tissue function at the level of kind of ecosystem organizing in the US. And we're not the only ones who are doing that work. I think that we probably draw a larger circle around the ecosystem that we're trying to impact. We kind of include three large buckets of the kind of social justice movement space, the bridge building kind of depolarization space, and then the democracy reform kind of technocratic solutions space. And each of those three buckets has like 20 offshoots of fields and networks and theories of change. And so it's a somewhat of an audacious goal to be weavers within those different networks and thought processes. But in the last 3 years, we're in our fourth year now, I think that we've been able to at least gain entree and validity as kind of a broker of ideas and people at the network level.
Thanks. Bunch of follow-ups from there, but would love to start with you mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of folks from the international democracy space, which is obviously at a precarious moment right now, that have gotten into the domestic democracy space. Besides the obvious of why that's happening, sort of challenges here and people looking to focus on democracy here, what specifically do you all or do you think that you bring to the domestic space having that international perspective?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a lot to say about that, right? So me personally, Julia Roig, having worked at kind of a network of networks, Partners Global actually functions as a network and invests in kind of local organizations doing local work and had a real approach of bringing conflict resolution skills, conflict transformation skills to the work of advocacy and citizen engagement and bringing kind of unlikely allies together. And so I think a commitment to kind of really practicing the way that we think we should be doing deep listening and kind of those conflict communications skills is one thing I've just been practicing my entire career. And then I think, the US is a huge, complex, federated system. And so the way that you do work internationally is always with a lot of humility and locally led efforts where people who experience, the problems and are the closest to it are the ones that you listen to most. And so I think with also years and years of practice of working in right relationship with the kind of local to national to international, I think that we bring kind of a sensitivity to the work of local first, and yet understanding that within an ecosystem, you actually do need connectors and national level platforms to support, the work across different fields and across different localities. So hopefully we bring that posture and that commitment. But I think that those are two elements.
Great. Going off that, the work that Maria's done, but you talked earlier about the you all bridging, not to use that term, but the peace building approach with the resistance approach. What does that look like? What are the tensions inherent in those approaches, if you can break that down a little?
Yeah, well, gosh, we're living that right now, aren't we? I mean, it's interesting. Even in the early days, 2020, 2021, when we were thinking about the Horizons Project, we actually named the problem we were trying to solve as polarization back in the day. And and so if the central problem that you're trying to solve is polarization, then you're essentially trying to bring down the heat, right? You want, civic friendship, understanding across difference, empathy. We're not as divided as we think we are. And there's just a totally different approach to change when you're in a civil resistance social justice stance, which is you raise the heat to disrupt complacency. You're bringing attention to issues that people want to like maybe look away from or don't actually see. You're trying to ripen issues so that, you're forcing people to address them. And so this raising of the heat and like lowering the heat, these are tensions. But quite honestly, I think a bigger tension that we find in these spaces is kind of our urgency versus gradualism and our the time frame from which we're trying to do this work. So a lot of the maybe resistance approach is stopping harms right now. Right now, there are harms that are happening that need to be addressed. They need to be stopped. We need to be in solidarity with the people who are on the receiving end of harmful kind of policies and systems. And I think that there's a longer term theory of the case, which is, very much kind of locally, we're going to start to kind of build relationships. And over time, hopefully, the best bridging and peace building work is 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 also building up those relationships to then move together to then kind of change the systems. So it's not either or. That's actually our theory is that, these approaches to change do go hand in hand. And I think where we're really struggling right now around the world and have been, since the beginning of my whole career is that we have a lot of contempt for each other when we're in different positions along this continuum of raising the heat and lowering the heat. If you're not making change the way I think we need to be making change, you're making my job harder. Or, I think that you're actively working against me when honestly, these are allies that we could be working on the same side of the table across from the problem.
So I'd love to appreciate that framing, because I don't know if I've even thought about it like that before, just in terms of the sort of inward look at it. But how, so you've talked about being the connective tissue, and then you talked about social justice, bridge building, democracy reform, technocratic solutions, and I can see the tensions inherent in that work. So how do you think about and part of my hypothesis would be, but I'm curious, I mean, you can push back, it's just like this is like basic like funding challenges too in organizations that are like um looking to ensure they're sort of pushing their own agenda forward, which makes sense. I mean, it's natural, but how do you think about you all, how do you think about you all serving as that connective tissue? And then more structurally, like, are there ways to actually bring fields together to better peace build and resist at the same time?
Yeah. So when I first started this work, when we first kind of separated Horizons out as its own organization, we were kind of doing a lot of scoping conversations and talking to people. And I would start off talking about ecosystem organizing and blah blah blah. And I had somebody say like, "Yeah, I don't really care about the ecosystem that much." And so I actually had a really big sticky on my wall that said, "What if I don't care about the ecosystem?" Just to remind myself that, there are people who have a lane, who have picked a lane, who have defined a problem and they want to solve the problem. And honestly, truth be told, and I think that's one of the challenges we face right now. With regards to the complexity of the problems that we face with regards to what's happening to democracy right now. So very early on, we took a very clear stance on the authoritarian threat in the United States and globally. And this is another tension, right? If you talk about authoritarianism, somehow you're progressive, or that's like a scary word. People don't really understand it. Um, and we're gonna have a much harder time bridging across difference if you lead with authoritarianism. Like, okay, yes. And we needed an analysis of both our history, the racialized authoritarianism that's been in our country since our founding, and what's happening now as a part of global trends. And so my, what guides my work, what is making me feel passionate about the connective tissue work is that not everybody has to do everything. I'm actually not even asking people to change their lanes. And yet, we do need to figure out how we fit together. So, the overused metaphor that I'm constantly talking about is the jazz band within a pro-democracy movement. So we do play different instruments. We step forward, we step back at different times. There isn't actually like a song sheet. There's no conductor. But there's a certain element of we are a group and we are working towards something which is, I hope, both to combat the current manifestation of the authoritarian threat and obviously think through what the future of our democratic project is, right? That it's not something that we're just against. We also have to be something that we're building, which, everybody's talked about. We don't know what this looks like, this multiracial, inclusive democracy that we're all building towards. And so, the connective tissue work is slow work, Scott. The time frame thing is like, this is slow work. You just have to show up at other people's things all the time and hear what they're talking about. Where do they have energy? What are they not talking about? Where are the gaps that so we don't see ourselves as the convener. We're not like trying to like bring everyone together, but little by little you go to different like networks and different coalitions and different conferences and you think, wow, they're not talking about this part at all. It's like at all. And then there's an because sometimes if you had to talk about it, you'd have to address it. You'd have to do something about it. Or in the name of being a field and having a lane, you just pick this part and you say, oh, well, we're not doing this other thing. And I just think that's we're going to have to reshape how we work in the future. And funders, per your point of like we get funded to do projects and to get credit for our projects. And all of us are going to have to work in different ways if we're going to kind of address the level of threats that we're dealing with right now.
I run a organization focused on structural reform like ranked choice voting. Do you think those, like, to the point of not talking about the other issues that are out there, is some of this that organizations should be thinking more holistically or be in community with organizations that are in the other work, or can they just be in their lane but understanding how they're part of the broader picture? I'm sort of curious, like, how this plays out best in practice. I mean, I guess this is basic field stuff, but like, I've had a lot of conversations with people where they do make this point that in the democracy ecosystem, everybody has their fiefdoms. And I'm curious, like, what are different ways to, you know,
Mhm. Mhm.
to evaporate that.
If you
Hmm.
actually think of yourself as wanting to change a system, what are the
Hmm.
practices and mindsets that you would have to adapt or adopt? And I do think to a certain extent it is raising your head above your own work, looking around and be like, okay, who else is doing what? And do I make the time to at least be in conversation with other folks, and nurture those relationships? And I think that that's a hard ask because we're all overworked and we feel so. That's just one. Like, do I even see myself as a part of this system?
Hmm.
And if so, if I see myself as a part of the system, then who are the folks who are most strategic for me to be in relationship with? You can't be in relationship with everyone. And I think that this is actually part of the role of ecosystem organizers to help the system see itself and to be like, these folks would really benefit from being in relationship with these folks. And also to be open to change. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm thinking is like there's a little bit of just that what's the bias that because you've been doing something for so long, you just keep doing the thing. I don't know that we also have enough space to actually consider like maybe I should be adapting to do this thing, but also not just do more of it, but also to listen to what else could be needed right now. Like, is this the most important thing that needs to be done? And I see a lot, our context has changed, Scott. We are living in a different country today than we were a month ago. And I'm not sure that I see enough people pivoting or even having the conversations about what's needed to be pivoting. Or so it's a lot of working within a kind of a systems lens or an ecosystem approach is how you sense make and who you sense make with. That I mean, it's literally like as simple as that. Like, who are you talking to? And are you talking to people who just think just like you to keep going and doing the same things?
Have you seen like when people are in those spaces and potentially have ability to like test ideas out that they become more comfortable with holistic thinking, that pivoting approach? Is that happening in real time?
Well, so I have been experiencing that, but I've been experiencing it with the groups that we've cultivated over time.
Hmm.
So, it takes a long time to develop that level of trust. And in a lot of our spaces, a lot of the coalitions that come together, the conferences, the fields, it's very transactional. It
Mm.
really is like, what are we sharing? What's the strategy? What can, offers and requests, and everybody's like, woo, going so fast that we don't actually even have the time to kind of be human together. And then, yeah, horrible groupthink, because, honestly, what I'm experiencing right now is more entrenchment within these different kind of theories of change, these different fields. But this is normal, right? Everybody's freaking out of their minds right now. No one is their best self. And if you're not your best self and you're like totally operating on lizard brain, and if somebody starts poking around in your own theory of change, like, well, what about this? Or I think you should be doing something else. You actually react defensively, and not only defensively, you get more entrenched and certain. What do we need right now? We need certainty. What I'm doing is effective, right? The most important thing to do. And so I don't see a ton of opening. I don't see a lot of containers or spaces for this type of work that we're talking, or this self-reflection that we're talking about.
How do you balance I mean, what sort of the responding to the immediacy when there are harms with the need to do self-reflection and pivot? Like, how do you balance both of those things at the same time when you have to be responsive, but obviously approaches haven't been working in the long term too?
Yeah. I mean, I've been reflecting on this a little bit with some colleagues. Is just like, what does leadership look like in this moment? And I think leaders have a tendency to take a lot on their shoulders and feel that we're the only ones who can do things. And so then therefore you get in do mode, lead mode, and we don't prioritize that like slowing down part to sense make, reprioritize, strategize, think deeply. And why do we do that? It's like we actually don't trust that other people can do what we do. Or we don't like delegate. It's not even, it's beyond delegation, honestly. It's just like if you step away, other people will continue to, this is the jazz band. Other people will continue to do the work. They are doing the work. We've got to like trust our colleagues. And it feels like this like navel gazing part of just like, oh, I'm going to go be with people. It doesn't feel like the work. And it feels like a luxury. And I just keep insisting it's like the most important thing that we can be doing right now. Not all the time, but at least take the time to do it. Slow down enough and then and hand things over to somebody else for a little bit and it's staggered. Not everybody can do it at the same time, but whew, we're not. We're gonna keep making the same mistakes, Scott. We are making the same mistakes. I mean, that's the issue. It's just like no one, like when do we pause to have a bigger conversation? When is that gonna happen?
As opposed to just becoming retrenched in what folks have always done.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
responding and I mean it's really wild to watch. And well, I actually kind of feel like we'll get there because I think we're going to have to get there. I think that we're, we're in a moment right now that feels like so frenetic and chaotic and crazy, and everybody's kind of trying to respond and or justify why you don't have to respond. You can keep, I mean, it was so funny. I had some people, even before the election to say, well, our strategy is election proof. So we're just going to keep doing, what our whatever we thought was needed to be done. We're just going to keep doing that. Okay.
How do you get people to care about democracy without telling them to care about democracy? Like without sort of making it specific
Yeah.
like that.
I mean, you may know or you may not know that, that this we have a narrative engagement across difference initiative
Hmm.
at Horizons, and that has been my baby for a long time. And, honestly, if you think that we're in this like kind of crisis of meaning making right now, I mean, that's like literally people don't know how to make meaning of this moment. And so, a lot of the work around like messaging and like making people like care about something that's like based on polling and like the surveys and like likely voters, I actually feel like that's ultimately doing us all a disservice. Because just again, like the polling and like the getting people to kind of like use these words, don't use these words somehow, and like people are going to think differently. That's actually to a certain extent making things worse. When we in my mind, we're simplifying the story around what we're trying to accomplish. Um, and it's a really simplified, like us, them, right, wrong, authoritarian, pro democracy. And we need to really be kind of, I used to say complexify these narratives around what we're actually working towards, but there's just a divergence of lived experience right now. And that's actually and so what is embodied democratic practices? I mean, I know this sounds jargony, but people need to like experience what we mean. We don't necessarily need to like message to them better. And so I'm getting then to what you're talking about with regards to the local and the national. I think embodied democratic practice happens at all levels. So people need to, it's not just, what Seth Kaplan is doing at the neighborhood level. That's great. Definitely. Neighborhoods need to know each other. All of the bowling alone things, join the civic institutions, be with people, find real connections, experience, citizen assemblies. Yes, like, experience like decision making locally. And I think that we also need within, our at all levels. meaning, we also participate in all sorts of different associational life or coalitional life, or, we are members of national organizations that also, need to kind of embody this kind of democratic practice and, voice and what we prioritize, what we don't prioritize. So I feel like part of the issue of why people have kind of turned their backs on a system that doesn't work for them or has never worked for them is like, really, we're not experiencing a lot of democratic values in our and so and that's on all of us now. So I don't think the pendulum needs to swing to say like, oh, well, it's all local. And we're experiencing what's happening at the national level. It is local. People need to experience their local governance. And we also need to be people working at the national level that kind of bring the kind of best knowledge, both um, from local groups, but also different kinds of knowledge about, where has there been kind of cross-state solidarity that's worked out really well, or that, people are like showing up for each other in different ways. Um, that that is in right relationship and is actually living the future that we want to create. So it's it kind of goes back to like the practices that I was talking about. And I know it's actually seems really maybe soft and fluffy, and I think it's the hardest thing to do right now.
Maybe you talk a little bit about the pillars work when you talk about bringing different folks together. I'm curious, like, what are some of the unlikely allies? What is the potential of unlikely allies in this space, or people that have not been brought into this work that you think need to be brought into this work more going forward?
Yeah. Um, I mean, there's a big push to get representatives of rural areas involved in the kind of national movement spaces. I appreciate that very much because I think a lot of times, whether it's coastal elites, all of the examples of why rural perspectives aren't included. I think race explicit organizing needs to be squarely a part of our broad front. This is the term, it's been Big Tent, United Front, we're using broad front now. Hopefully, that doesn't get caught up in some of the literature around what it means, like a broad pro-democracy movement. A lot of the kind of technocratic democracy spaces, they're not race explicit, honestly. And part of that is in the name of bipartisanship somehow, or transpartisanship. And I think it does a disservice for a country that needs so much healing from a history of, well, all the things. And so it's a group that then needs to be brought together with center right, conservative faith leaders and business leaders and, veterans and, all of the different identities that we kind of show up. I think obviously the genderized attacks are, the folks who are working on gender but from multiple perspectives, and also kind of, on issues of what we're calling aspirational masculinity now as opposed to toxic masculinity. So we're starting at least with folks who already are convinced that broad tent, big tent organizing should happen. So we're not
Hmm.
convincing
Hmm.
people of this. And yet, it is a facilitation challenge, Scott, how folks who come with very different perspectives and lived experiences and priorities will find themselves as a part of a shared struggle. And it's a facilitation challenge we're really excited to take on because I think, the movement or the moment requires it of us.
What are you most worried about right now within the space, not like within America as a country, but within the
Yeah.
ecosystem, the field right now?
That we're falling into the trap of the shock and awe tactic as it's been laid out quite clearly, keep us confused and overwhelmed and divided in our efforts. And so, one day it's Department of Education, the next day it's USAID. Did we even remember about the January 6th, pardons? Or, and so I am the most worried that there isn't yet the discipline with regards to like the most important things, the big picture, like really what do we need to be focusing on and holding folks accountable for? And, of course, I'm the most worried perhaps about the complete takeover of, payment systems and infrastructure in a way that it doesn't matter who's going to be elected next. We won't ever be able to get that back. And so, part of the mindset shift is, and why we need to be taking a step backwards is absolutely to be collectively focusing on the biggest issues. And I see people just doing more of the same, just louder, more with more outrage. I think that a lot of the negative emotions that we all feel right now, whether it's fear, anger, when we use that as our mobilizing force, it also feeds into the playbook. And, we're definitely not infusing enough hope, joy, vision for the future, allowing for people to also divest from a movement that is about ugliness. And so we're not, we've talked about this. It's, creating the infrastructure for people to join in to a movement beyond any partisan identities. And so I think what created this moment, I think we just keep doing more of the same, and I'm worried about that.
So I guess, I mean, the opposite side of the spectrum, like what are you hopeful for? What would make you hopeful? I mean, I assume the opposite of that, but how do you see that happening?
Yeah, more people are activated and paying attention and, reaching out to each other. I do see these, mutual aid networks popping up everywhere. People are taking care of each other. And that's beautiful, and that's actually what we're going to need more and more of. And that's both, conservatives. So if there's a pastor that stands up and says something from the pulpit, and their congregation is kind of upset about it, and they get fired, the mutual aid network of like, no, no, we've got you. We standing up for a moment of values. I think that those mutual aid networks are becoming stronger and stronger.